wanted to talk today about something that actually woke me up really early this morning, and that is what's been happening in 2020. And what I find really interesting is that this past year kind of mimics what I grew up with. Now, let me explain. And I actually did an interview this morning on a TV show where I talked about this a little bit as well. And I'll put a link for that show in the comments below. What I realized this morning is that 2020 has been a macrocosm of the microcosm of my childhood. And I find this really fascinating. So when I was a little girl, I grew up in this very controlled environment where everything that I experienced was managed by the people in charge. So for example, I didn't watch television. I wasn't allowed to listen to the radio. I had no access to what else was going on in the world, except for specifically what my leaders wanted me to know. That also, of course, included my parents, but it extended out to the religious leaders of this little community that I grew up in. The other thing that's interesting, and also our money was completely controlled. So this little microcosm that I grew up in was very much like communism, but on a much smaller scale. So the leaders controlled how much money we had. My dad actually gave his entire paycheck to the leaders of the church, and then it got dispersed supposedly evenly among everybody else in the community, although as I was growing up, it was obvious that some people were given more money than other people based on the lifestyle that they had. Even as a child, it was obvious when somebody had a nicer house and a nicer car and nicer things than we did. So the men who ran the community basically had us running on as little as they possibly could. A bit like communism, right? Controlled narrative, controlled information, controlled money, controlled life. I wasn't allowed to leave, and the women weren't allowed to leave this community. So it was kind of like lockdown, right? Only the men were allowed to go out and make money, and those who had businesses, and then everybody else basically had to stay behind closed doors, and the kids only got taught what the controlled narrative was in school. So there's that. The other thing that I find really interesting that compares to what's happening in the world today is the conspiracy theories. Right now, we collectively are calling them conspiracy theories. In my mind, they're only conspiracy theories until they're proven as fact. And we've seen over, well, at least the decades that I've been alive, that sometimes the conspiracy theories actually are fact once they get proven, and then the official narrative changes and the media finally comes out and admits that what the conspiracy theory was is actually proven fact. A lot of times that's with particular companies that don't want you to know that they have created a product that is known to be harmful, but they don't want people to know. So, or a toxic spill in the water that it takes a while for media to finally admit it's real and it's not just a conspiracy theory. Anyway, so when I was a kid, a lot of the stuff that's floating around in the airwaves right now as conspiracy theories were the same ones I grew up with. The anti-medicine, only I think much more extreme, anti-medicine, anti-vaccines, anti-government, anti-taxes. We were basically against everything except for the religion that we grew up with. But it's kind of interesting to see that some of those narratives that I grew up with are actually floating around in the mainstream, and they're coming out into the greater collective consciousness to be exposed. Now, whether they become fact or remain fiction, I don't know. Some of them I think are way out there, but I don't know. Until they're proven as fact, it could all be fact, it could all remain fiction. I don't know. I just find it fascinating to see how so much of what I grew up with in this little teeny tiny microcosm of a dozen houses, well, it started out as only 6 houses, but it eventually grew to almost 1,000 people, is playing out in the entire global collective right now. I'm fascinated by all of it. And I think it's really interesting to see how it's no longer just held in these teeny tiny microcosms, but the entire world is getting to see how controlled narratives work, how controlled money works, and how these radical concepts are also playing out in the greater collective. Now, like I said, I don't know. I can see some things. I do have the gift of insight and the gift of foresight. And I do know that we are bringing heaven to earth. We no longer have to die to get to heaven. We're actually being given the opportunity to bring it here to our planet. And in order for that to happen, we need to be able to undo a lot of the damage that's been done and remove the controls of fear that are presently plaguing our planet and have been for thousands of years. So for people who think this is a brand new thing, there's nothing new about what's happening in the world right now. It's been going on for thousands of years. It just changes, the narrative just changes a little bit, and the people who are in control change. But the story is still the same. The story is still the same of how we are learning how to work through the contrast of fear and how we are learning to work through the contrast of control to bring ourselves back to heaven on earth and bring ourselves back to freedom and bring ourselves back to a love-based consciousness. Because here's the thing, when every one of us is working through our life from the environment of love, there is no need for control. Because when a person is living their life from an environment of love, there's no crime, there's no desire to cause harm, there's no need for prisons or jails, because we're all living in this consciousness of love and genuinely wanting to take care of each other and genuinely living from a heart of compassion and genuinely wanting to do what's best for the planet. We don't need controls and narratives and taxes or any of that to make us do the right thing. And so when enough of us start to understand that we are the change that we want to see in the world, is actually the embodiment of us. And when we learn to live from a truly, genuinely loving, compassionate heart and seeing the world through the eyes of love, all that other stuff becomes basically non-existent. It doesn't matter who did what or who does what or any of that. That's an old story we've been telling ourselves. When we learn how to see that story and actually learn the lessons from the story instead of just playing around with it and pretending it doesn't exist. And see, we have a collective shadow story that has not been properly navigated. It has not been dealt with. It has not been recognized as a shadow part of our story. It has not been processed through the eyes of love, through a loving process where we extrapolate the value of the learning lessons from it. You see, human beings were meant to learn through joy, not through suffering. Yet the way we have set the systems up, or the way they have existed for us for the last 10 to 12,000 years when fear came to the planet, is that we've been learning through suffering. And we don't have to learn through suffering. The key is to look at all of our stories collectively and as our own individual stories, recognize the shadows in the stories, and learn to process them and see them all through the eyes of love. That's the only way we're going to break out of this hell on earth that we're presently in and fully come to live in the heaven on earth that we are meant to experience. And it's up to every single one of us to bring that experience into ourselves rather than pushing it off and blaming it on everybody else. Take responsibility for our own actions, for what we've brought to the story, and be willing to do the work to process the collective story. It's not easy. Processing our pain stories is painful. And it's necessary for us to move into this next reality that we are moving into. 2020 has been a great example of how the microcosms are reflected in the macrocosm, and how each of us who have gone through this process of healing our own personal pain stories can use that process on a collective global scale. And it's up to us who have done that work for ourselves to show the rest of humanity how to do it. Because most of humanity doesn't. They're just stuck in the narrative. And it's up to those of us who have seen the narrative, and who experienced the narrative, and who have processed our own pain stories to show the rest of humanity how it's done. Each of us is at a choice point. We can either choose to allow the status quo to continue and the story to repeat itself again and again and again and again, as it always has, or we can choose to stand up and be light warriors and actually do something about making a change in the world. That might be something like having your own show, or it's maybe sitting down with people and actually creating entirely new systems. Because one thing that we have seen is that our current and existing systems do not work. And either we can consciously create new systems that do work, or we're going to watch somebody else create systems that work on behalf of the people at the top, while the rest of us serve the people at the top. Or we can choose to get together and create conscious systems that serve everyone, without division, without separation. And so this message, I guess, is really a call to action. How does what's happening in the world right now reflect your own story? Have you processed that story? Have you extracted the lessons from it? And how are you using what you've learned to help change the world? That's my message for this morning. And until next time, be fearless, be fabulous, and be free. Mwah. And be sure to hop on over to my official website at victoriareynolds.com to pick up a copy of my newest free guidebook.